Greetings programs, welcome back to the grid. I am Sark and today's game is Lights, Shadows, and Exposure in 3D Studio Max. Hopefully not too ambitious of a subject for one video. Today you can see that I've got my basic scene set up. Finished modeling everything, finished all the grapes, finished the vines. For the vines you just got to enable your line or your spline in viewport and in renderer, and then it has a thickness. Default thickness of 1 was too big, so I set mine to 0.15. 0.15. I think that's all. That's all I haven't shown. So, if there's any question about how to sculpt these objects, most of them are pretty easy. So, with lighting, you can see that by default, 3ds Max does a very CG looking job. And that's probably true of most 3D software packages, because they're actually really powerful tools. They can do really photorealistic things, but the way that you achieve those things is not always the same. It's not like there's a checkbox that says make it realistic, right? So you're going to have a default setting that's kind of a jack of all trades. And while there are like kind of realistic shading on the edges of our surfaces, it's, objects are not casting shadows on each other. They're, things that should be glossy are not glossy. Obviously, a lot of that's going to come down to individual materials. The material for our grape is not going to be the same as the material for our clay jar or our wooden table. But before we get into individual object materials and start tearing our hair out trying to make the grapes have the appropriate amount of subsurface scattering and things like that, we ought to establish some baseline lighting. So, first thing I want to do is hit F10 or go up to rendering and choose render. Or not render, what do I mean? Render setup. Shortcut for that is F10. And I'm going to turn on the art renderer instead of the scanline renderer. So if you have your scanline on, which is default, there's your image. If you flip it to the art renderer, you're actually going to get a slower render. Yeah, it's going to take a good bit longer, and you're going to get this grain. And you might think that's really undesirable. But there are some tricks for dealing with that, and the reason the grain is there is that the art renderer is actually using global illumination. It's actually starting to sort of calculate how the light bouncing off one surface might affect another surface, and that's why our shadows all got a little softer. So this is going to be a more realistic rendering solution. Now the reason I'm using the art renderer, the Arnold renderer is actually probably the most advanced and most powerful rendering solution built into 3D Studio Max at the moment. I would say that's more comparable to what Mental Ray used to do. The art renderer is like a dumbed down version of it, which I think is great because there are enough settings in 3D Studio Max between your camera settings, your light settings, your material properties, your environment settings, that you don't really necessarily need a renderer also to have loads and loads of menus. So you have a couple options here, advanced and fast. So if we set this to advanced, we're still doing a draft quality render. Hit F9. Took it maybe half a second longer, didn't really see a big difference, so I'm going to leave it to fast for now. Then you have draft quality versus high quality. So I could set this up to high quality. You really don't want to go to X high or max unless you're willing to leave your computer on overnight for your final image, or you've just got, I don't know, some 32 core monster. I haven't. This thing's got, 4 cores or 2 cores hyper-threaded or something like that. It's like an i5 from 2014. So here we go with a high quality render. No advanced lighting in the scene. There's a default light. It seems to be casting shadows, but No reflections, base material. Okay, took us, you could see a good like 10 seconds. So we definitely want to leave this on draft quality because as we start to add all those things I just mentioned, it's gonna get worse in terms of the weight. There's also a noise filter. I usually turn this on and leave it at about 50%. You can already see the difference in grain between our high quality render, which looked pretty good, and this, although, yeah, with that noise filter not too bad, and I don't think that's too expensive to leave on, so we'll do that. So that's it. Those are all the real options in the Arnold render. Point light diameter, I guess. All objects receive motion blur. So you could like override the diameter of all your lights. Yeah, I'm not really going to get into that. So let's just look at our free light. So I'm going to hit Alt W. I'm going to remove our background for now. We're going to end up replacing it with some things later on. So right now we're just going to render a black background. It's actually going to make our scene inferior in some ways because the objects are going to be sort of reflecting a vacuum, but that's okay for now. Oh, before we plunk our light in, I'm going to go into our material editor. So right now we have a basic standard material on our objects. I'm going to switch this out. Actually, let's just make sure that it's on all our objects. Opacity, 10. Yeah, that's everything. 100. So I'm going to click where it says standard. Click where it says standard. And then I'm going to choose this physical material. This is a material designed to work with the art render. It also works with Arnold. And it's sort of a replacement for, like, I guess if you were in the scanline renderer, you might be using like architectural stuff to achieve this effect. But what the physical material does for you is it sort of has settings built in for almost any kind of different realistic surface detail you might want procedurally. So everything from a rough concrete material to a frosted glass material physically simulated to, you know, old copper. Now it's not going to look right here in our viewport, but when we hit render, if the art renderer is on, or I believe if the Arnold renderer were on, yeah, everybody looks at that and says, yeah, that has kind of a copperish look to it. So these are very, very powerful tools. And we just change the whole look and feel of our scene with a click. Obviously, in the end, we're not going to be using one material for all our objects. But for now, I want to. Because it'll sort of be a one less variable to be concerned with when we go to our lights and cameras. Just as I chose a very, very simple rendering solution, we're going to choose a very, very simple material solution just to get started. So I'm going to choose glazed ceramic. I'm going to make sure the material mode is set to advanced. I'm going to go to, so here's the default glazed ceramic, by the way. So you could see that everything's a little reflective, everything's super glossy. And now what we're going to do is make it into a very dull ceramic. So I'm going to take the clear coat away. That should do away with most of the gloss. Yeah. And we still have like slight reflections. Nothing too crazy, but I'm going to take the reflections off too. So I'm going to take these to 0. And now our render time should be a good bit quicker. We're in like the 10-second range, which is pretty good, all things considered. So now, again, looks kind of like our original scene. Next thing I want to do is plunk in a light. So I'm going to choose a free light from the photometric lights. Do not use the Arnold lights unless you're using the Arnold renderer. They won't work with anything else. Arnold doesn't really want to work with anything but the Arnold lights for the most part. I think it might work with the photometric. It definitely doesn't want to work with the standard lights. But the art renderer will work with most of this stuff. I use the photometric lights because why did we bother setting up our scene with precise measurements otherwise? It is recommended that you use the physical camera exposure control. Yes, that is what I want to do. So, plunk in our light. We'll talk about exposure controls in a minute. So here you can see we're moving our light around, but nothing's changing in our scene. And it will change in the render. Right, you can see the lights coming from above and to the left, which is where my light is located. But wouldn't it be nice if we could like see what we were doing? That'd be cool, right? So we're going to go to standard and we're going to go to our main physical camera 001 viewport, which should be like where your perspective viewport was if you've been following along. And you're going to click where it says standard, and you're going to go to lights and shadows, and you can choose illuminate with scene lights. And as long as we're at it, we can turn on shadows too. I don't think it'll be too expensive. And then go to our light and go to its modifier panel and turn on shadows. I'm going to use advanced ray trace shadows. I think that area shadows don't really work that well with the art render. They're really more of a tool for the scanline or for mental ray. And with the advanced ray trace shadows, the difference between them and the ray trace shadows is not that they look better, it's just that they render a little faster and look nearly the same. Truly ray trace shadows are actually slightly higher quality, but efficiency is the goal here, right? We want bang for our buck, and that's going to be with the advanced ray trace shadows. So now you can see that as I move our light around, it's casting shadows in real time. Pretty good. Not too hard on the old processor yet. I do have a decent video card in here, but I don't think 3ds Max is taking advantage of it. I think that's the main advantage of Arnold. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the deal is it will actually use your GPU, and that's why that's why it's so powerful. So anyway, all I want to do is match this up to my original image as much as possible. Let's get a look at our reference. Here it is. Okay. So, actually kind of feeling okay about that. Oh, there should be a little more shadow under the lip there. So that indicates to me maybe the light needs to be higher. Yeah. And then I don't know if I want it to be further left. Let's look at that. We'll go with something like this. Might be higher still. So let's see how that renders. I think that's probably a decent match for what's going on in our scene. Maybe a wee bit to the left. With something like that. Now, our shadows are a little too harsh. Part of it is that we have one light source and we don't really have any fill light. The art render is using a little bit of global illumination, I think, but the edges of our shadows are just like hyper crisp, right? So there's a trick for that. We're going to go into our light settings, and instead of a point light, remember earlier in the renderer there was a setting for like the point light diameter? We're going to forget a point light. We're going to use sphere. In this case, the default setting for the sphere is 5.5, and let's render now. All our shadows got a lot softer just now. The edges of them got softer. And of course with our low draft quality, that's going to sort of exaggerate the noise problem, but these are going to be much better in the long run. So happier about that already. Now you have in candles intensity, the brightness of your light. Thankfully, I think we're almost done. We get through the camera and we're done. So we did the material, we did the renderer, we did the light. Almost finished the light here, and we're onto the camera, and we're pretty much done. So people used to measure brightness in foot candles. There's another unit of measure called lumens. You might see like on your light bulb that you buy at the store, it tells you how many lumens it produces. Then there's lux, which is like lumens with like distance and fall off. So like what is the lux at 40 feet? What is the lux at 30 feet? So without getting too technical, we're just going to leave this on candles for now. We're going to leave it at 1500, and we're just going to double or half it as we feel like we need. There's no reason to try and, like, I don't know, produce the exact anything. I guess you could try to, like, oh, well, at 8 a.m. in Florence in I don't even know what time of year it's supposed to be, in August, with the lights coming from this direction and is going to be this bright. No, that's craziness. Okay, let's just say 1500 candles at a couple feet away, which is how far our light is away, trying to sort of represent natural light or the sun. I wonder how many feet. Yeah, our light's like 20 or 30 feet from the target. Good enough. Time to go to our camera. Actually, time to hit 8 and go to our exposure control. So these things are connected. Remember when it asked if we wanted to add an exposure control? And we were like, oh, I don't know, this is a scary menu. It's like giving me some kind of crazy warning. All it is doing is switching from this, which is the default, which we can agree it looks a little underexposed. There are no longer any real highlights. To one of these options. And I think it wanted physical camera exposure because we were putting in a physical light. And so the whole point of that is, hey, I noticed you are using a light that wants to be measured in candles or lumens. Like you must be doing something photometrically. You must be measuring the photorealistic qualities of your scene. Would you like to simulate realistic exposure? And the answer is yes. There are automatic exposure controls if you're not feeling like you know what you're doing in here. But the physical exposure is great. The default one just measures in exposure values. So if I set this to 1 EV, we're just stepping up in exposure value. It's sort of like stopping down, I guess. You could go -1, -2, and now we're underexposed again. So what's nice is we've got this checkbox here to use the camera controls if available. And what that means is even though we've got a global exposure of 6 from, I don't know, somebody decided that was a good number for some reason. What happens if I take that to 0? Oh, it doesn't really matter because we're using the camera. So I think if we were, yeah, right, except it goes the other way. Yeah, I'm not going to mess with global exposure because we have a camera and we can change its settings. We're going to use this camera control. So that's it. And then you've got a little preview here, which is great. When you're just testing lighting and you just want to see if it's too bright or not bright enough, why would you render thousands of pixels when you can render dozens of pixels, right? You can think of this as like the viewfinder in your camera while you're adjusting your exposure on like a modern digital camera or something. So here's our actual camera controls. We're in the modify panel for the camera. And we're going to do some things to try and create a more realistic look. One of the things that cameras do that CG doesn't do unless you tell it to is that some things are very crisply in focus and other things are out of focus. This can be used to achieve an artistic effect called bokeh, right? See if I can type. So that's like when you see bright lights at night and they're all like blurry out, and it looks pretty. But the best bokeh is not just the blurred out image, it's something in hyper focus, right? So the narrower your focal band is, that is to say there's a certain distance at which things will be in focus and everything either nearer or farther from that will be out of focus, the crisper your subject will be. Where if everything's in focus, everything's kind of like a little blurry. But if you manage to get your subject in like really crisp focus and everything else out of focus, that's the desired artistic effect. Now that's not what we're going to be doing here. Our camera's field of view is too wide for that, and our scene is too simple for that. We don't have a bunch of crazy stuff going off way in the background. There's like a wall. And there's not going to be something sitting right in front of all of our objects, right? Like I could put a teapot, I guess, like right in front of the camera. And if you want to understand this effect, like your eye is also a lens, right? So to understand what I'm trying to explain here, just hold your finger up to your eye and focus on it. You'll notice that everything's out of focus. Hold your finger up to the eye, up in front of your eye, and look at something far away from you, and you'll notice that your finger might as well not be there. It gets blurred out. So CG does not do this, right? If I render this right now, this teapot is very much in focus, and that's unrealistic. So to deal with that, we are going to set our camera up to have some of those properties. One of the things that we adjust is our aperture. So we're actually going to reduce let me see. Yeah, I think we're going to be treating it as though we're indoors and it's dark. So we're going to set our aperture to like 3.5. We're going to have a shutter speed. The longer the shutter is open, the blurrier the image will be. A thousandth of a second is a very, very fast amount of time. That's like sports photography. That's why you could catch a runner or an Olympic jumper or something, or a cheetah, and you could have it in perfect focus, right? But since this is a still scene, we can assume that somebody just sets up a tripod. A 60th of a second is probably about as slow as you can have the shutter open, and still manage to hold the camera still without a tripod. If you're very good and very patient. So that's letting more light in. Then we have our exposure value. I'm going to set this to manual, and I'm going to set our film speed down to like 400. That's like a normal film speed in ISO terms. So these three numbers affect how bright the image will be. Right. Our image got darker because I slowed down the rate at which the chemical, the simulated chemical or the sensor, the simulated digital sensor allows light in or reacts to light. Okay, so our scene got darker. Our teapot's no blurrier. I think if I take the aperture up to like 22, now I'm letting a lot less light in, right? Yeah. No, so I want it down to 3.5. I want to let lots of light in. I could take the duration down to 1/30th of a second. Who says we don't have a tripod? All right. Oh, you know what? We're not simulating any focal depth. Silly me. So I've been changing all these numbers around, and I have not enabled depth of field. So you see, if I enable depth of field, that we have these planes, and so the darker one, or the shaded in plane, that's the one where we're focused. We're focused right on that peach. That seemed to me the focal center of the image. And out to either side, just a couple inches, is everything that will be in perfect focus. And then at a fall off from that point, towards and away from the camera, things will be less and less in focus. So now if we render, I believe our teapot will be well out of focus. Yep, just like your finger in front of your eye. So that's the desired goal. Remember, this isn't really going to matter too much, because you can see that all the objects that are actually going to end up in our scene are pretty well in focus. But maybe just the things that are further away are a little softer, and that's just the really subtle effect we're going for. Of course, this teapot is not going to remain in our scene. It is just an ordinary reference teapot. So, actually I ought to leave it up there for a moment just to show you how some of these things do affect the focal depth. So if we turned around and left our shutter open for 1,000th, a 1,000th of a second is shorter, and then it becomes necessary to open your to increase your film's reactive speed, right? Like theirs was like, I don't know, 1400 or something. Now our teapot's still pretty blurry. So I guess that has more to do with aperture. So if I had the aperture closed, and then I had this at, like, I don't know, 800th of a second, and I had the ISO just like crazy high, right? Like 2200. Like real cameras don't even do these numbers. Yeah, it's still it's way too dark. So then, like, you would be increasing the amount of light in your scene like crazy. You'd be going up to, like, I don't know, 4,500 candles. And yeah, got a little brighter. You could see that actually my teapot gets crisper. So if I increase the light, if I increase the exposure, if I do artificial gains after the fact, you know, kind of do the sports photography thing, then you can be back to where this is much crisper. But we're just trying to simulate what a real camera might do and how it might interpret this information. Really, part of our fun here is that we're sort of reverse engineering a painting and saying, okay, well, what if there was a camera there where the artist was sitting? How close can we get to what he saw? And we know we're not going to be like dead on. I'm going to have this open for a 1/30th of a second. That's a good long time. I'm going to have the ISO down to like 400, but I'm going to have the aperture wide open at like 3.5. 3.6, I feel like that's a very common aperture number. Alright, so everything's super bright again. And if anything, we could even reduce our film speed a little bit. Down to 100. 100 might be too dark. Let's see how it goes. That's pretty good, actually. So these things can all be adjusted later on. I just wanted to show how easy it is to start. Like, if you're a person who has some photography experience and you know what these numbers mean, you know, there's nice little rollovers that explain it, like the sensitivity of the sensor, which in the old days, again, was like the chemical properties of the film and how fast it reacted to light. Or if you scroll over the shutter speed, it'll explain like what shutter speed is and why a bigger number after the 1 and the slash, that is to say, why a bigger denominator means that the shutter is open for a shorter amount of time, right? Because it's fractions of seconds. Or why the field of view might affect your focal depth, and things like that. So they've finally done a really nice job of sort of tool-tipping all this stuff, but if you're a person who already understands photography from a physical point of view, what's nice about the language that's used in here, which might just be viewed as jargon for the average CG user, unfortunately, is correlates to realistic results if your scene is set up with the right proportions and the renderer is set up to take advantage of the light in that way. So I'm pretty happy with this. The only other thing I would want to do maybe is fill in our shadows. Our shadows are a little too dark in some places, but I'm going to get into that with the next video. So for now, if you hit F10 and you set your render quality up to like high and press render, you should end up with a scene that's what's nice here is we're starting to get some of that global illumination. So you can see that this is the dark side of the picture, but there is a brightness inside its shadow, and that comes from the light hitting the brightest surface of the jar, which happens to be next to the picture, and that bright part is reflected most in the darkest part of the picture. So these are the sorts of interactions that objects have in the real world that you may not notice, but definitely affect the overall detail and realism of the image in subtle ways. Alright, so that's Lights and Shadows in 3D Studio Max with the art render. Good luck, have fun.